The second verb that I used was to enlarge. And to enlarge to me means a deliberate effort to nurture a wider worldwide coalition of principal partners. Not the key partners themselves, not the key strategic partners, but of principal partners who are committed to the principle of interdependence and are in fact major players in the context of the emerging global interdependence. And that too means an effort to engage on a systematic basis in consultations. It also means some institutionalization of that process. I think it is evident by now that the G7, later 8, has outlived its function. The G7 started as an informal council of the advanced industrial democratic societies. Russia was then added to it, and certainly it is an industrialized society. Its democratic credentials at the time of addition were perhaps debatable, but they were to some extent there. Today, they are much less in evidence. And in any case, a narrow group like this no longer accounts for the realities of the modern world. It doesn't follow from it, however, that the G20 needs to be institutionalized as the functional equivalent of the G8. I would probably personally, if I had the opportunity to define the membership, opt for something more like G14 or G16. That is to say, countries that have economic weight, but also political or geopolitical strategic weight on a regional basis. And that would still mean a much more representative process of consultation and the beginnings of a rudimentary system of global management. In many respects, the meeting of the G20 initiates that process, and it will be repeated over time, and hopefully it will also give birth to the emergence of something of this sort, which is clearly needed beyond the formal mechanisms of the UN, which, while formal, are also almost eternal because it requires consensus to change them, and those who benefited the most from the arrangements made in 1945 are clearly not prepared to reform the UN to reflect the modern realities of global power. So in that sense, something outside the UN is an essential imperative. To engage, in my judgment, involves at the same time as the other two, the creation of a very informal, not institutionalized, process of regular informal dialogue among the key strategic powers of the world. That is needed, and is particularly needed in order to engage China in the process of global responsibility, global sharing, global interdependence. China is the most important rising power in the world. And without China, many of the key problems that we face cannot be effectively addressed. With China, they have a higher prospect of being responsibly met. And China, so far at least, is generally constructive in its international conduct. It is economically nationalist, and that is a problem. But it is fundamentally a cautious and patient revisionist power. Cautious, patient, revisionist power. It wants the international system to change, but it is cautious in the way it is pursuing that objective, and it is patient. And one of the hallmarks of the Chinese leadership is foresight and patience. I have dealt with the Chinese leaders now for 30 years. I go often. Whenever I go to China, I meet the top leaders, and I've gotten to know them. And I have to say I have high respect for their sense of direction, but also balance and proportion. I cannot do better than repeat what Deng Xiaoping said at one point about the Chinese approach to international affairs, and I quote, "Observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, and bide our time. Be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. I think that the contrast between that, and that precisely is what marked Deng Xiaoping as really one of the outstanding statesmen of our time, and the current Prime Minister of Russia speaks for itself. And that brings me to another point, namely that we have to involve Russia in this process too, irrespective of the suggestive contrast that I have just drawn, because Russia should be part of such a dialogue. But actually, if we move in the direction of such frequent dialogue, and I have literally in mind meetings between heads of governments of state, between America and China, Europe, America and China, Russia will not want to be left out. Russia will not want to be left out, and it might be a very salutary inducement to obtain Russia's good behavior in international affairs, without some of the saber-rattling and impatience and frustration and posturing that has been seen lately. And in that respect, incidentally, I think there's also the makings of a natural division of labor in dealing with Russia between the United States and specifically Europe. For America, Russia is a world power in the area of nuclear weaponry. That is the one area in which it is a global power. And therefore, it is a special responsibility of the United States to continue constructive dialogue with the Russians about strategic issues and to seek new arrangements, new agreements, replace, start, etc. Disarmament, weapons control, eventually perhaps moving towards a world in which the presence of nuclear weapons is dramatically decreased. But Russia is simultaneously a regional power, not a global power. And that affects Europe the most. And I think Europe has a special responsibility in trying to engage Russia in a fashion that draws Russia into Europe, but without an imperial baggage that unfortunately still too many of the present generation of Russian leaders wish to bring with them. Unlike Great Britain, and in a much more painful way, unlike Germany or Japan, Russia has still not come to terms with its new global status and new global condition. It is a major national state. It is no longer an empire. It lost that empire peacefully, relatively speaking, but it lost it and hasn't accommodated to that reality. Indeed, it hasn't yet been willing to face up to the true meaning historically and morally of its communist experience and specifically of its Stalinist experience. The foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, recently said that to equate Nazism with Stalinism is a blasphemy. But there are millions of people who feel that the two are profoundly similar and equally painful. This process will take time until a new generation of Russians emerges. But in the meantime, one should continue efforts to draw Russia in, to engage, but also to try to create a political context in which it becomes not more easy, but less easy to try to recreate an empire. And here, of course, two particular issues are sensitive and difficult, namely Ukraine and Georgia.